Hello, welcome to the webinar about how food and design can change the world and how you can be a part of that. Well, there are a few things I want to start with. First of all, I think we do not need new things. Second of all, I think it is not about the food. And the last thing that I would like to share with you is the world doesn't need more solutions. And I will explain to you why I think these things. My name is Marije Vogelzang. I'm an eating designer. I started working with food as a designer 20 years ago when I was studying at Design Academy Eindhoven. After that, I had 2 restaurants for 7 years. I have my own practice. I work globally, and I am the head of food, non-food, which is a department at Design Academy Eindhoven, and I'm the founder of the Dutch Institute of Food and Design. And in this process of 20 years, where initially when I started, no one really understood why anybody would want to do something else with food than just either eat it or cook it. People weren't even thinking about growing it. No one understood why a designer would interfere with food or would work on the topic. And in between that time and now, where we are in a time that people actually do see that food is very important, that we are made of the food that we eat, that we understand that our landscapes are being defined by the kind of food that we eat, that the way that we practice our food culture or the way that we practice agriculture has a definite effect on our global society, on climate change, on how we feel as human beings, whether we feel healthy or not. And this knowledge and this insight is gaining lots of momentum in these years. And it's very interesting to see that eventually, people think that designers, they make products or they make new things all the time because they are creators. But I really don't think that we necessarily always need new things. Of course, new technologies are always evolving, and I think I'm not against new things, but I would like to make a case to find ways of looking at what is already there and not to necessarily create new things, but to create new perspectives on the thing that you think that you already know. So it's creating new perspectives on the things that you think that you already know, like food. So we all eat, we all, we have to eat. So I'm sure that if you're watching this, then you have eaten in the last few days, probably. So everybody understands food, but the funny thing is that, and maybe that's because we all understand it or we engage with food, that we don't really understand the true value of food because it becomes such a commodity, as now the largest part of the world is having enough or even too much food, which is in itself fantastic. Obviously, it's amazing that we are living in the land of plenty. We're living in this time that our ancestors were longing for. This time they wrote books about it and they created paintings about if ever we would live in a land of plenty. Oh, I would be so grateful. I would pray on my knees every day because I would thank God that I had so much delicious food. And the paradox is that we do have this food, but I hardly ever see anybody in the supermarket running around making little dance, being so grateful for all this food that's there. So that's why making new things can be something to do, but I think creating new perspectives so that people feel different related to their food, that they actually understand the true value of that food, and they don't only understand it with their head, but they really truly feel the connection to the food. And that doesn't mean that it needs to be a kind of highly spiritual journey towards the food. It can also be very down to earth, but that you really truly feel appreciative of the food, or that you feel connected to the person that made the food, or that you feel connected to the person that you're eating with. So all these things I'm talking about is not necessarily being a designer, creating something new. It's actually being a human being, understanding how to look at things in a new way, in a different way. And there are tools to practice that. There are tools to train that. And I think it's really important that we start to understand that by changing our perspective, even if it's just a little bit, we can actually change a whole food culture. We can change food habits. We can change, therefore, also our landscapes. We can change our own health. So even though food and design is definitely not only about this, I do feel that as a kind of base, as a kind of underlying solid structure below anything that you do with food and design is the understanding that if you change a little perspective, it can actually have a huge effect. So, and the funny thing is, and the cool thing is that this is actually very simple. So a friend of mine told me a story last week about his mother, and his mother was always using these wine boxes. So you have this boxed wine, right? And it has a little tap on the side, and she had it standing on the on her kitchen countertop. And it was leaking, so the little tap was leaking, something was wrong there. And she put things underneath, and she was really running around with little pieces of kitchen towel, and she was getting a bit upset. It was affecting her because she just didn't like it, and she was like all the time putting lots of focus on this tap of this boxed wine. Spilling the wine, and yeah, it really bothered her. And then my friend, he said that was interesting to observe, because she was very much focused on trying to handle the issue in a way of dealing with the leaking tap. And it took him a while to get up, because first he wanted to just observe what she was doing. But then he got up, he walked to the box with the wine, with the leaking tap. He took the box and he just tilted the box and he put it on the kitchen counter like that. You don't have to design, or you don't always have to design new things. You could have designed like a special tool that you can hang underneath the tap in case it starts dripping, or you can design maybe wine glasses that you always have to hang underneath the tap so that the wine will always drip into a wine glass. Or you can design new kinds of packaging so that in case a box starts leaking, that the package will absorb it, and then maybe then you can suck the wine out of the package. That sounds horrible. But you can also just change perspective. And I think it's very cool because you can do that within food and design, but obviously you can apply that to everything in life. First to look at the underlying structures, and then of course you can always start to design something on top of that or besides that. And I also want to make sure that you understand that I'm really not against making new things. But before you do that, to really look at what are we really dealing with. And so that's how I come to my second point about food and design. So I don't think I have to really explain to you that I think, food design is something different than food and design. And also sometimes I call my practice eating design, because I work from the verb of eating, which can be harvesting food, transporting food, the culture of food, food and health, food and medical science, food and science itself. So it's like food in a really bigger perspective. So food and design is not necessarily food design. So it's not necessarily about like making beautiful food, although the aesthetics of food, of course, it is very important, but it is a tool for communication more than it is the design itself. So it's a tool, it's not the base. So my next point is about food itself, because food is not about food. And I think it's very important to understand that food itself is only food because I or you as a human being decides to put it in my mouth and to chew it and to swallow it. And that defines that the food is food. Otherwise, it's actually just a plant. Well, not just, it's a plant, or it's an animal, or it's an egg, or it's whatever you normally digest. But if you do not eat it, it could also become waste. So understanding that food, even if you work as a chef, it's actually not about the food. You need the human eating the food to actually make whatever you produce, that material, to make that food. So understanding that food is not about food, but that it is about humans, and that it is about plants, and that it is about animals, and that's about bacteria and everything in between, really broadens the idea of what you can actually do with that. So to understand that, and when you focus on the eater, the human being eating, that whenever you do something with food, you always have to think about the person that's going to eat it. And I see so many times in restaurants or in other places where people are so focused on the food that they actually forget about the human being that's eating the food. But the human being is a magnificent machine of splendor, full of thousands and thousands of sensors all over their bodies, and they can use these. But generally, we don't really address all the human senses. We're just putting people on a chair and then giving them something on a plate with forks and knives to distance themselves from their food. But there's so many different ways that you can use food to make people aware of their senses, to make people excited about things, to make people more aware about things, to give people experiences that they never had before. And that's so crazy, because when I started working with food, I thought it was such an obvious decision to link food and design together that I didn't know other people in the world working with food and design, but I was really certain that I would leave school and then eventually go into the world and find other people that would make that connection, because it's so obvious that we can create tangible poetry, edible poetry. But I couldn't find it. And still nowadays, even 20 years later, we do have the Dutch Institute of Food and Design and many more food and design platforms and networks. We have various food and design schools. I have my own department at Design Academy Eindhoven. So there are more and more people stepping into the realm of food and design. But still, if you would compare the amount of people working with food and design compared to the amount of graphic designers or fashion designers, product designers, interior designers, then it's still like tiny. It's a tiny, tiny group of people that work with the largest topic. It is the largest topic. It's the largest economy in the world. It's the most influential topic in the world because it actually literally shapes us. It shapes our bodies. It shapes how we think. It even shapes our memories and emotions. It shapes our politics. It shapes our landscape. It shapes our biodiversity. And still, the world of food is populated by specialists, which is fantastic because specialists know exactly how to make the best quality food of a certain specific type. But the thing with specialists is that they focus on their specialty, and for them it's hard to connect to other people in that food chain. It's a very untransparent system. And I'm not blaming anything or I'm not judging anything. I mean, to be a specialist, it does require to focus. But within this food chain, there is so much space for creative minds that can link all these specialists together to create new and unconventional connections that might come up with new solutions that bring different changes, small changes perhaps, but all these little changes will have a bigger effect on the world. To say that food and design in itself would change the whole world, I think that is arrogant. But I do think that because food is the biggest economy, because food and food culture is everywhere, and because people are eating every day simply to stay alive, it is the most basic human need. And because that is there, if we would enter this space fully, and if we would create a more sensitive, a more resilient, a more sustainable and more poetic food culture, we could actually, with all these little changes, create a wave of huge influence in the world. And you might feel overwhelmed when you hear this because you think maybe I can understand, like, wow, do I have to do all of that? No, you don't. You don't have to know all these things. You don't have to you don't have to have, look, my nails are really ugly. I just noticed. You don't have to have the knowledge of all these professions because there are already specialists. So if you focus on one little thing, and if everybody has their specific thing to focus on, I mean, in between the specialists, but then still, you know, design fields are also defined by your personal preference and by your personal fascination. If you have a little field to work in, and even if you just make tiny changes, for example, you have a food company, or if you have like a restaurant and you think, yeah, but my customers are not used to like highly conceptual things. Of course, that's really normal. But if you can just create small changes, so suddenly they think about what they consume in a different way. Maybe you change the menu a little bit. Maybe you change the way you present the food a little bit. Maybe you think about different sources for the kind of food that you present. Then that they will carry that home with them, and they will also spread that around. So, of course, I always focus on the highest level. I want to work on the highest level, but filter down from that. And that's really the reason why I started doing online courses, is to inspire people that are already working in the field that are already having their practices or that are setting up their practices, to understand that these are really simple tools that you can put inside your business. You don't have to suddenly change the whole world, but all together we will change the world. And I think that's very cool. The other thing that I think is kind of a misconception about maybe design in general, but also food and design, is that I think that we don't necessarily need more solutions. The idea that design or creative thinking is about coming up with solutions, I think is very limited to what you can do. I think it is much more interesting to come up with more questions than coming up with more solutions. Because generally when people define a problem, and you can wonder if something is always necessarily a problem, some things might be. But if you define a problem and want to come up with a solution, then you get a kind of tunnel vision. But if you just decide to not necessarily define a problem, and maybe you do see an issue and you start to just be curious about it and ask questions, that is a very different approach. And from asking questions, lots of new things can come up. And instead of solving problems, you might be able to come up with new scenarios. Things that maybe not necessarily deal with the problem, but maybe these new scenarios distract people from the problem and make them behave in a different direction. And I think that's a much more intelligent way of looking at things than just defining problems and coming up with solutions that sometimes, and maybe more than we like, these solutions actually come with other problems. So just shifting direction by asking questions, I think is a much more inspiring and much more powerful thing to do. For example, if people are obese, many dietists subscribe obese people a diet. And, that sounds logical, but we also know that diets are really hard to keep up, because you feel that you have the problem of eating too much or eating the wrong things, and then you have the diet, so you actually stop doing that and you have to start doing that. And people feel, because it's not about the food, it's about the people feel restricted, they feel not empowered, they feel locked in this new pattern that doesn't really inspire them. So wouldn't it be more interesting to start raising questions about these people, about what is food actually, what is food to them? And perhaps you can find like a new route that inspires them to take this new route, that actually make them move towards a more healthy behavior without them feeling restricted, without them feeling like a part of their identity or a part of their desires is taking away from them. And I think desire is a very interesting word, because desire is not about food, it's about the eating human. Desire is about what actually drives you. So if we understand about desire, and obviously marketing knows a lot about desire, marketeers know a lot about desire, but many times that's kind of directed in a very commercial and many times not very healthy setting. But to understand these principles, we can also use it in a different way to make people experience a richer life and a more healthy and profound connection with the food. So these are the three things that I wanted to talk about, which is asking questions, understanding that it's about humans, the eating human, and not about the food, And when you talk about the eating human, you also talk about the plants and the animals and bacteria and everything that is involved with food that we don't directly see as food, and the waste, for example. And the last point is about that we don't always need new things, but that we do need new perspectives on the things that we have around us, because we already have an amazing world around us that many people actually don't see, because they're just like you now, and me now too, looking at our devices. So what I would like to challenge you to do, whenever you look at your practice, whether that practice is food and design, whether it's food styling, whether maybe you have a catering business, or maybe you have a restaurant business, or maybe you work in food marketing, to start looking at your work in a new way. First of all, to start asking questions and to not think in definitions of problems, but really to look around you and to wonder, if you just if you walk in the marketplace, or if you go to supermarkets, to just ask questions like, why is a milk carton blue, or why is it red? Or how would it be if it was purple or yellow? Or maybe it is in your country, but not in my country, for example. So if you just ask questions like, why do we eat certain food in the street, but do we not actually eat it at home? Or the other way around, for example. That really frees up your brain, because it can really help you to come up with completely different ideas. So if you want to take this to the next level, I really would suggest you just write down lots of questions about food, like about when you're just at your dining table, like, why is the size of the spoon this size? Why, is it this weight? Why do I use a fork for that? And why do I not sit underneath my table instead of sit at my table? Why do I not actually lick my table, but I do lick my spoon, for example? And maybe you think, yeah, but that's just bullshit. What will that do for me? Well, the thing is that you never really know. Like in kindergarten, the kids, they learn how to fold these little square papers and make a little box from it, right? I don't know if all kids do that everywhere, but Dutch kids generally have this exercise. And then you can think, yeah, but why do they learn that? Do they ever in their life need that again? But actually what you do is you start imprinting in your brain this way of thinking, so you understand how it works. And by doing this exercise of asking lots of questions, you start to imprint in your brain that actually asking questions is an option, and you start to do it more and more. And you will find that once you start to ask lots of questions, even if they're absurd questions, that you also suddenly see things in a new way. So I would really challenge you to do that. The second thing is the idea that food is not about food, but it's about humans. And I think psychology is very important here, to really see that there is really a distinction between what we consider food, but what we actually eat. So here I would like to invite you to look at the world around you and to actually see all the things that could be food, but that we don't actually see as food. So, for example, I see a lot of weeds when I walk around, and I always think, yeah, that's actually food. And it's not only weeds, there are so many more things that could be food, but we actually don't eat it. And sometimes I see waste, and then we see it as food, but it's actually not food anymore unless we eat it again. So to just think about this notion that food is not necessarily food, and that it is about humans. So if it is focused from the food to the human, then what would you change in the practice that you do? Maybe that means that you actually would have to focus much more on the physical experience. Maybe, and I know that, right now while I'm filming this, we're in the lockdown, so we cannot actually give massages to our clients. But there are so many ways that we can make food and the eating experience much more sensorial, even without actually having to touch each other. And this is something that has such a huge potential, because right now people are ordering food at home, they're in their houses, they are getting always the same thing. They're just always getting boxes with things, and there's so much potential to add new ways of dealing with the food experience to really give people a more fully sensorial experience, for example. So think about the human being, think about their psychology when you work with food. How would they feel it if they're being addressed in a different way? If the food would arrive and maybe, they get a poem with it as well. Maybe that's horrible as well. Something just to think about. Think about changing your perspective from from the food to the human. So we had asking questions, we had focusing on the eating human, and the last one is about changing perspective. So it's the story with the wine box. Are there things in your practice right now that you're looking for solutions to, but you've been so much looking in this tunnel vision that you just don't really know how to change perspective? Or maybe you didn't even think about changing perspective. You thought about, maybe I need to buy something new for that. Maybe there's a broken table and maybe I need to buy a new one, but maybe it's actually really nice to put some books underneath. And while you're there, then the books can also have another function. I don't know if it needs to be something like that, but I am inviting you to really think about what is already there and how can we make people see that in a different way. So if these things are things that you can use in your practice, I would like to invite you to look at my online course. I'm starting an online course very soon, actually, because I was planning to do it in May. But since I see that so many people within both the food world and the creative world are really struck by this virus and are really struggling to find new ways to deal with their work and their business, I decided to already start this online course the 16th of March, which is April, 16th, of April, which is very soon. So if you're interested in these kind of principles to understand what the world of food and design looks like, what are the opportunities, what is the landscape, what is already being done, how can you find inspiration for your practice, and also how can you change your practice, whether you're just starting as a food designer or whether you're already established as a chef or a restaurateur. How can you bring your food practice to a way that you can help people, that you can help consumers to have a better experience, that you can help your clients, for example, if you work for food agencies, for example, and also how you can help yourself to build a more solid practice, how you can stand out, how you can make sure that you don't sell yourself cheap, for example. I know a lot of designers working with food and that just started, and they have no idea what their value is, and people don't understand really what they do. So within this online course that I'll be starting, I'll be focusing on giving you the tools, like really simple tools, homework assignments, to actually really get that going, to get your practice going, to really make this way of thinking, this mentality your natural practice. Secondly, to show you what food and design can really be with tangible examples, with every week a slideshow and explanation. It's live session, so we'll have discussions and you can always ask questions, so we can really go deep on the subject. And next to that, I will also be helping you to find for your specific purpose, to teach you how to find your own solutions there. Because this thing is, and that's really why I started doing these courses, you know, people can hire me, that's a big part of my business, to come up with solutions for their business. But what I really want to do is to teach people how to come up with these for themselves. So they don't always have to hire me or my colleagues, but they can actually do it themselves. And they can inspire other people doing that as well. Because what I really, really, truly want is to bring a wave of positive food creation influence in the world. That sounds horrible. But I do think really that empowering people to change, even if it's a little bit, their food practice, it will really have a positive effect. And I would be so delighted to be part of this movement, because it is a worldwide movement which is going on. And I would love to accelerate this so we can become more healthy, more happy, more related to our food, more appreciative of the value of food, more connected to other people through food. And we can just have a more healthy and balanced food system. And while we do that, we actually have the job we love, we play with food, and we also make a healthy living with it. And especially since food and design is such a young profession still, I think it's really important to educate yourself how to make this into a true profession. And with that I mean a true profession that also gives you a healthy a resource, so you can continue to develop yourself and you can live healthily and abundant. And the funny thing is that this makes perfect sense, because I see that the food world really, really needs creative visions. They really need new ideas to come up with solutions of today's time. And I do see there are wonderful creative people in the world. So I think it is a perfect match, and this is the right time. So I hope this webinar has been useful for you. And you can always drop me a line, ask me any questions. You can send an email to studio@marijevogelzang.nl, and also through Instagram and Facebook. As I'm at home, I can get back to you very quickly. Thank you, and I really hope to see you soon. Bye.